I shall tell the tale briefly. The Saxons attacked us. It took Ael over an hour to persuade his men to assault our shield wall. And for all that time, the dung-spiked wizards screamed at us. The drums beat, and skins of ale were passed around the Saxon ranks. Many of our men were drinking mead, for though we might have exhausted our food, no British army ever seemed to run out of mead. At least half the men in that battle were fuddled by drink. But so men were at every battle, for little else serves to give warriors the nerve to attempt that most terrifying of maneuvers, the straightforward assault on a waiting shield wall. I stayed sober, because I always did, but the temptation to drink was strong. Some Saxons tried to provoke us into an ill-timed charge by coming close to our line and flaunting themselves without shields or helmets, but all they received for their trouble were some ill-aimed spears. A few spears were hurled back at us, but most thudded harmlessly into our shields. 2 naked men, turned blood-mad by drink or magic, attacked us, and Killock cut down the first and Tristan the second. We cheered both victories. The Saxons, their tongues loosened by ale, shouted insults back. Ael's attack, when it came, went horribly wrong. The Saxons were relying on their war dogs to break our line, but Merlin and Nimue were ready with their own dogs. Only ours were not dogs, but bitches, and enough of them were on heat to drive the Saxon beasts wild. But not one dog bit a Briton, and the Saxons, who had been ready to launch their killing charge, were thrown off balance by the failure of their dogs. They hesitated, and Ael, fearing we would charge, roared them forward, and so they came at us. But they came raggedly, instead of in a disciplined line. Coupling dogs howled as they were trampled underfoot. Then the shields clashed with that terrible dull sound that echoes down the long years. It is the sound of battle, the sound of war horns, men shouting, and then the splintering dull crash of shield on shield. And after the crash, the screams began, as spear blades found the gaps between the shields, and axes came hurtling down. But it was the Saxons who suffered most that day. The dogs between the shield walls had broken their careful alignment, and wherever that had happened to their advancing shield wall, our spearmen found gaps and pushed into them, while the ranks behind funneled into the gaps to make shield-armoured wedges that drove ever deeper into the Saxon mass. Keenaglass led one of those wedges, and very nearly reached Ael himself. I did not see Keenaglass in the fight, though the bards sang of his part afterwards, and he modestly assured me they did not exaggerate much. I was wounded early. My shield deflected the axe blow and took most of its force, but the blade still struck my shoulder and numbed my left arm, though the wound did not stop my spear from slicing the throat of the axeman. Then, when the press of men was too great for the spear to be of more use, I drew Howlbane and stabbed and hacked her blade into the grunting, swaying, shoving mass of men. It became a pushing match, but so do all battles until one side breaks. Just a sweaty, hot, filthy pushing match. This one was made more difficult because the Saxon line, that was everywhere about 5 men deep, outflanked our shield wall. To guard against envelopment, we had bent our line back at its ends to present 2 smaller shield walls to the attackers. And for a time, those 2 Saxon flanks hesitated, perhaps hoping that the men in the center would break through us first. Then, a Saxon chieftain came to my end of the line and shamed his men into an assault. He ran forward on his own, swept aside 2 spears with his shield, and hurled himself at the center of our flank's short line. Cavan died there, pierced by a lunge of the Saxon chief's sword, and the sight of that brave man single-handedly opening up our flank wall brought his men roaring forward in a wild, elated rush. It was then that Arthur charged out of the unfinished hall. I did not see the charge, but I heard it. The bards say his horse's hooves shook the world, and indeed the ground did seem to quiver. though perhaps that was only the noise of those great beasts that were shod with flat iron plates strapped tight to their hooves. The big horses hit the exposed end of the Saxon line, and the battle really ended with that terrible impact. Al had supposed that his men would break us with dogs, and that his rearward ranks would hold off our horsemen with their shields and spears, for he knew well enough that no horse would ever charge home into a well-defended spear wall, and I did not doubt that he had heard how Gorfethid's spearmen had thus kept Arthur at bay in Lug Vale. But the exposed Saxon flank had become disordered as it charged, and Arthur timed his intervention perfectly. He did not wait for his horsemen to form up. He just spurred out of the shadows, shouted at his men to follow, and drove Clamray hard into the open end of the Saxon ranks. I was spitting at a bearded, toothless Saxon who was cursing over the rim of our two shields when Arthur struck. His white cloak streamed behind, his white plume soared above, and his bright shield threw down the Saxon chief's banner that was a blood-painted bull's skull as his spear lanced forward. He abandoned the spear in a Saxon's belly, and ripped Excalibur free, carving it right and left as he drove deep into the enemy's ranks. Agravain came next, his horse scattering terrified Saxons. Then Lanval and the others crashed into the breaking enemy line with swords and spears. Ael's men broke like eggs under a hammer. They just ran. I doubt that battle took more than 10 minutes from the dogs beginning it to the horses ending it, though it took an hour or more for our horsemen to exhaust their slaughter. Our light horsemen raced screaming across the heath as they carried their spears towards the fleeing enemy, and Arthur's heavier horses drove among the scattered men, killing and killing, while the spearmen ran after, eager for every scrap of plunder. The Saxons ran like deer. They threw away cloaks, armor, and weapons in their eagerness to escape. Al tried to check them for a moment, then saw the task was hopeless, and so cast off his bearskin cloak and ran with his men. He escaped into the trees just a bare moment before our light horsemen plunged after him. I stayed among the wounded and the dead. Injured dogs howled in pain. Kiluk was staggering with a bleeding thigh, but he would live, and so I ignored him and crouched by Cavan. I had never seen him weep before, but his pain was terrible, for the Saxon chief's sword had gone right through his belly. I held his hand, wiped his tears, and told him that he had killed his enemy with his counter-thrust. Whether that was true, I did not know nor care. I only wanted Cavan to believe it, and so I promised him he would cross the Bridge of Swords with a 5th point on his shield. "You will be the first of us to reach the other world," I told him. "So you will make a place for us." "I will, Lord. And we shall come to you." He gritted his teeth and arched his back, trying to suppress a scream, and I put my right hand round his neck and held my cheek against his. I was weeping. "Tell them in the other world," I said in his ear, "that Derval Cadern salutes you as a brave man." "The cauldron?" he said. "I should have—" "No," I interrupted him. "No." And then, with a mewing sound, he died. I sat beside his body, rocking back and forth because of the pain in my shoulder and the grief in my soul. Tears ran down my cheeks. Issa stood beside me, not knowing what to say, so saying nothing. "He always wanted to go home to die," I said. "To Ireland." And after this battle, I thought, he could have done that with so much honor and wealth. "Lord," Issa said to me. I thought he was trying to comfort me, but I did not want comfort. The death of a brave man deserves tears, and so I ignored Issa and held Cavan's corpse instead, while his soul began its last journey.